There's something totalitarianism offers, which a lot of people deeply enjoy. I won't say a lot of people, some people. It takes away all control you have over your own life, but it gives you incredible power over the life of your neighbor. So you can't rule your own life. You've lost free will within your society, but you can destroy somebody else's life, or you can improve somebody else's life. So that ability to lord over somebody else or to have power over somebody else, for some people it's a great substitute for freedom. And that, once that is reinforced through diverse psychological means, through mass media, Castro used television, which Cuba had a lot of. Cuba was one of the countries in Latin America that had the greatest access to TV in the late 50s. He used television very ably. Once you use mass media, there was no private education. All education was controlled by the regime. Once you control everything being printed, once you control leaving and entering the country, then people become enclosed within a very narrow tunnel where very little information gets in. And unless you have very strong convictions and you're very firm in your beliefs and your faith and you understand history, you can get trapped in that mindset. Many have broken with it. There is a way of breaking through it, but it's not difficult because it's a limiting of the spiritual ascension of you as an individual and of your society.
We defined severed conscience as a state of mind that traps an individual, cutting them off from exercising their faculties and to perceive reality by remaining open to manipulation through progressive and technological means. While the tragedies of history have similar facets, when we compare those societies to the state of mental health in our society today, we will see that we have been in an even weaker position than people of past failed dystopias. Now I caution you, when you hear the phrase, "it can never happen here," it is surprising that even those who have claimed in history utter this phrase, and while they may know history, they do not understand the history of man. What is amazing is that the deaths of millions and treating humans worse than cattle has been done in the name of building better societies. More misery has been visited upon humanity by acceptance of the collective good over the value of the individual. Even in our early American history, we have evidence of fear-driven purges of communities. The utopians managed to render one of Europe's most prosperous nations, Russia, into complete shambles, killing millions through starvation and outright extermination. One consistent requirement of utopian procedure is detachment of its subject from ordinary human affairs. Acting with detached intelligence is what utopians are all about, but a biological puzzle intrudes. Detaching intelligence from emotional life isn't really possible. In this next episode, we are going to look at the history of manipulation.
This is part 2 of our series, Severed Conscience. And as O just said, we're going to be looking at the history of manipulation. Part of the mission when we started is that we wanted to make sure that we had identified something that was unique. So in other words, there have been other theories of mass control, and we wanted to ensure that that what we're presenting is not just another form of another theory. We think that what we witnessed with COVID and what we're witnessing today is a new condition called severed conscience, and that is when we have our rational faculties that allow us to make ethical and moral decisions have been turned off, and we're basically entrapped into a means of thinking where we don't perceive reality. So we turn to history as to give us examples, and unfortunately, human history is full of examples of mass manipulation. And we're joined this morning with Kelly Trowell. Kelly was kind enough to champion our efforts last week, and so I want to welcome you again, Kelly. Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, Al.
So when we laid this out, we thought, boy, oh boy, oh boy, there's so many pieces that we could touch upon. Uh, and so we decided for discussion that we were going to focus on three. And when we opened the series, we talked about individuality. And one of the things that we pride ourselves on as Americans is having a very, very devout sense of individuality. And I think with a degree of irony, we're going to go back to our own history and witness the deception, mass control, and people being influenced through fear. And our first topic is the Salem witch trials in 1692. And obviously this took place nearly 100 years before our fight for independence. But this was a time when people indeed were cowed by fear and controlled and manipulated. So just going to give some background here before we enter our discussion of where we see this manipulation taking place. So in 1689, William and Mary had started a conflict with France, and this was known as King William's War. And so they fought this in the colonies, which was upstate New York, Nova Scotia, and Quebec. And so this had the end result of driving population into the surrounding areas, when it drove refugees to Massachusetts. Now, if we all recall, the Puritan struggle when they first settled Massachusetts for growing food, so resources at this time were still a struggle to procure and provide for people. So if you can imagine you're in your small town or village and you have other people move in, your sense of Christianity and charity says that you must help them, but it becomes an issue that you have to manage. So the strain on resources was felt in Salem. And in my research, I found that Salem actually consisted of a town, which is basically a town being a step down from the size of county. So it could be a larger region. And there was an actual village itself called Salem. So at the time, there was one church, and the village wanted to form their own church and thereby sort of break away, collect their own taxes. In Massachusetts, taxes were collected and then distributed to the church. The church had, everyone attended church at the time, but a church member had voting capability and had sway, therefore, in the community in general. So in the village of Salem, you had the minister parish who would have benefited through increased patronage of his church. They petitioned the governorship 20 years earlier to break away, and they were granted this in a provisional format. So to further illustrate this, you've got a shifting tax population, and there were two families who dominated the region economically at the time: the Putnams and the Porters. And so the Putnams were the family that wanted to have the church established and maintained in the village. And the Putnams were the ones who were serviced by Parrish, the pastor. And it's interesting that the pastor's daughter was one of the first victims of witchcraft. So to sum up for people, as most people may know, but we'll just go through this briefly here. 1692, a group of girls fell ill. In the end, all accusers in Salem were female, ages ranging between 11 and 20, but they were primarily pre-adult stage, in 11 to 12 years old. So this first group claimed that they were bewitched by a slave called Tituba. Tituba was owned by one of the families in the village. And so, amazingly enough, Tituba confessed that she was forced to sign a book in the evening, and this she thought was Lucifer. And so, at the time, in Europe, witchcraft trials were ending. And in Europe, thousands of women were killed due to witchcraft. But over in the colonies, being separated and being secluded, this superstition persisted. Now, interestingly enough, at the time, Massachusetts lacked a governor, and so you had what they called the Great Revolution in England, that there was changing of hands, and so now there's literally no governor in Massachusetts. So the colony is sort of in chaos. So I think with great irony, the colonists who insisted on their rights as Englishmen for trial and for the ability to stand their accusers, this was denied at first. So those rights were suspended over this outbreak of witchcraft. And as time went on, they ended up accusing 180 people of witchcraft. 144 were brought to trial, and 19 were hanged. Included in this group that was incarcerated was a 4-year-old. So, in a sense, this witchcraft caused such fear and paranoia that you took a 4-year-old and you're holding 4-year-old captive, and you were hanging people. And this was without due process. So this is alarming. And again, as Englishmen, they understood that they had certain provisions where they could go and, okay, I'm accused of witchhood, of being a witch. I now can go and sue for defamation, but that was suspended at this time. That was not allowed. So the trials spread to 3 counties in Massachusetts. And interestingly enough, when the governor's wife, after they appointed a governor, when the governor's wife had been accused of witchcraft herself, the trials magically ended. So this happened here in the United States. This is within the group of people who, again, are governed by British common law. The pride of Britain is that as English citizens, you had certain rights, and they came with you to the colonies, and those were thrown out specifically. So, Kelly, I just wanted to ask you in terms of your knowledge with the Salem witch trials and the fear and paranoia, what sort of parallels you see to other societies, and then where do you think this falls in terms of the manipulation that people were able to exert on each other?
I think it demonstrates widely how there's a contagion effect that happens. We see this all the time in crowds. We see this in a number of social settings where people get swept by an emotion, and it's promulgated by a fear. Well, the fear is, if you're being possessed and, you've got forces that you can't see, that seem intangible, but yet you can feel this heavy weight of oppression on you that says this is something that is happening. And then people begin to expound on this and exaggerate this. That influence, that contagion begins to spread, and it begins to shift our ability to recognize people as individuals, and that they have a right to be heard and understood, but also to be evaluated for their position. The fact that, they're looking at a 4-year-old and saying possessed, witch, whatever, and some of the accounts that I've read are absolutely fantastic in a very bad way, but fantastic in the sense that, if we look at that in modern parlance, we're thinking, how foolish. But, in truth, it happens to us on a pretty regular basis. We just deny it because this seems so remote, because we think of them as being ignorant and, illogical and somehow less sophisticated than we are now. Actually, I think they were much more sophisticated than we were, because they didn't have the subtle influences of technology pulling at them and the myriad of distractions. They were in basic survival because, as you said, now we're having to worry about food for other people. So there's already a push on our community. And then, the stressors of trying to be in a new land, trying to make it, difficult winters, conditions that a lot of these people, were finding very foreign. So, just a lot of factors playing into how that social contagion severed their ability to be able to treat people with human empathy and humanely.
Yeah, and it's interesting. One of my heroes, Richard Feynman, the physicist, has a discussion where he talks about witchcraft and superstition. But then he turns and he says, okay, I want to just, those were conventions for describing things, and they operated, they operated based on the knowledge that they have. Well, do we do the same thing where we're operating based on the knowledge that we have? And he uses a brilliant analogy. He says, imagine the sun is setting, okay? And on the planet, there's this line of darkness, right? That's proceeding across the planet. And then everyone on that line where it's getting dark, what do? They go, they grab their toothbrushes, and they start brushing their teeth. Well, why do we start brushing our teeth? Well, because we've been told that we need to use fluoride in toothpaste, and that's a good practice. And clearly the health benefits from it. But why do we think that this is so essential? Well, because the dentist tells us. And Richard Feynman says, okay, well, the dentist has gone to school and they're trained, but can they tell you why fluoride in particular is of use? Why is this something we need to do? And many of them can't do it, but yet we're doing this as a ritual. So you have things become ritualized.
Yes.
That I think we forget that. You know, we're looking through the frame of history. We're the smartest because we're here now because we're breathing, right? They're dead, right? They had their chance and they're gone.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that I found in reading materials on this, again, is this idea of the Putnams and the Porters. And I think that people clearly, and humans are smart, they realize the manipulation that could take place through this promotion of fear. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing is that, and I'm drawing very, very wild conclusions here, so I'm just going to warn everyone. This minister Parrish was aligned with the Putnams, and his daughter was one of the first to accuse, and this spread like wildfire, as we just said. But it's interesting to know that those who were aligned with the Porters, the other family, those are the ones accused of witchcraft. So clearly here you're seeing weaponization of behavior, obviously, and it's a very, very clear distinction that, hey, it's a region, it's these people who either had done business with the Porters, who were aligned with the Porters, you know, who were attacked. So obviously here we've got a strategic use of this paranoia. And when the trials first started, again, and this is before even Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather's the very, very famous reverend who came to and presided over these trials. But before Cotton Mather, they instituted the practice of using people's dreams and hallucinations as evidence. And, you know, that promoted so much paranoia. But at the same time, if you think about, okay, if you're able to use my dreams, my feelings, my imaginations, I can make wild claims. And you go, well, who else would institute this other than the devil? You can do pretty much what you want. That's a pretty powerful tool, I think. And I'm hard pressed to be convinced that people didn't realize this and use this. I think common sense says that people stoop to those factors, as well as with fear that, okay, I'm afraid of being accused, so I may go ahead and accuse someone else first, right? So I've got, well, what's happening? Okay, I looked at someone. I looked at her. Is she going to accuse me now of being in league with the devil? Preemptive strike kind of idea. And so I think it's just interesting at that time that, again, this was used for political ends. I don't think that we think about that in this framework. When we think of Salem witch trials, the modern analogy that we draw is McCarthyism. Right. And interestingly enough, turns out that McCarthy was right about an awful lot. You know, so it's just interesting. So I think the one other topic that we talked about with regards to Salem prior to was that you had mentioned, and I wanted you to kind of go into detail about this. You had mentioned that potentially some of the hallucinations were due to something that they were eating, that there was a mold.
Yes, and the grain. So here's and I meant to look at this before we sat down today, and I didn't get an opportunity to. So, was it about 10 years ago, there was a documentary that was done on the fact that because of a couple of really harsh winters, some of the grain that was stored had moisture that was inside, and it fermented the grain, but it caused a bacterial reaction that when it was ingested, people would experience hallucinations. Sometimes they would have what they call night fits. The separation from reality on the part of these people, it acted like a hallucinogen. We've seen this periodically throughout this country and in others when this happens. And it spawns a period of time where as it's working its way through the system, and depending on whether or not they continue to take in that grain that's contaminated, this can last for several days, where people go into these hallucinogenic states, and that departure from reality means that they become wildly unpredictable because they're not interacting the same way that you and I are. They're interacting in a whole other cerebral level. And so, some of the documentation around this, there's a document that's at the museum where the trials were held, and the document talks about a problem with grain, and it was something that was supposedly an inadvertent find, but they were commenting that horses were behaving as though they were possessed, mules and some of the other animals were behaving erratically, which is, one of the things that they had looked at and said, this is possibly not. The guy that was the researcher, again, this was several years ago when this documentary was done, but he had talked about the fact that often a hallucinogenic state, depending on the dosing, because again, we've always heard the poison is the dose. I think, if someone understood that, it would also be a potent weapon, because we have to remember too that a lot of these farmers had a significant amount of knowledge around the types of things that they were growing and doing. And I think our first assumption is that everybody that was a Puritan basically showed up and lived in a house and somebody else did all of the things, and they didn't bring any knowledge with them. But they brought a lot of those farming practices with them, so they would have had an acute understanding that this is something that potentially could have been used. And if we have a problem with somebody, we've seen evidences. Shakespeare even wrote a play about a woman who poisoned her husband.
Right.
There are a number of ways that people have learned how to manipulate the people in their world, like you said, for political gain. So I think that's something that we need to consider. And then in terms of modern parallel, look at how we've been poisoned. Look at all of the ways that we are being indoctrinated into unhealthy lifestyles. And we're told, rely on pharmaceutical companies and doctors whose primary training is identify a symptom that you can give a drug to and then send them out the door. And then you've got them for life. Right.
Gut biome. That's our concern. And, vitamin D and the production of serotonin, et cetera, blood-brain barrier and all of that. And in part 3, we'll talk more about that. But clearly, we've had this here, and that's my point of bringing up Salem. I think that's part of our history that we have remote memory of. But I think it's in terms of, you had a people who had rights, and those were thrown out the door. I think that's the one important factor.
Severed conscience is the examination of the prison in the mind. We are trapped by social media and unable to exercise our ability to make moral and ethical decisions. To join the conversation, leave a comment, or access the full documentary, please come join us at severedconscience.com.